countdown, and we have quite a few countdowns in our lives. We have, for one thing, how many have ever seen them launch a space shuttle? Does anybody ever watch when they launched the space shuttle? I remember when I was in elementary school and they brought in one of those TVs and they said, today we're going to watch as they launch the space shuttle, and they brought in that TV, and there's that giant space shuttle, and they start out, it starts with you can hear the voice, they go, and they start, we're getting ready for takeoff, and 10, 9, 8, as they get closer to it, the smoke comes out and the fire starts, and finally 0, and the space shuttle launches off. And then there's Christmas, the countdown to Christmas. Stores don't want you to forget. So when you walk into the store, right there's normally a sign that says 18 shopping days left, 8 shopping days left. It helps you to count down. Kids even have the advent calendars, right, where for 25 days they open the door and there's a little piece of candy. I want somebody to invent a 365-day advent calendar so I can get candy every day of the year by counting down, okay? Be working on that. There's a countdown to Christmas. There's a countdown for elections. This last year, we had the presidential election, and every time I looked at the news, they would have up in the little corner, it would say so many days until the election as they were counting it down. I remember how upset I was in the 2000 election. Some of you weren't even born. Some of you don't remember. How many do remember the 2000 election between Bush and Gore, and a year of a nasty election that went on, and then they counted down the days, and we got to Election Day. And I remember being at home that night, and I was watching, and fairly early in the evening, they said it all comes down to Florida, right? They said all the other states, we know what's going to happen. Florida's where it's at. And fairly early in the evening, all of the major news broadcasting things came out and said, we're calling it for Gore. We're saying Gore has won the election. And almost immediately they came back out and they said, we take that back. We were basing it on exit polls, not on the votes. And as the votes are coming in, they said Bush is getting a lot more than we thought he would in some of these counties. So now we're taking that back. And it just stretched on through the night. And finally, in the middle of the night, I was still glued to it, and in the middle of the night, Gore came out and conceded the election. He said, I've called called Bush, I've told him I concede, and congratulated him and all that. And then I fell asleep, but I left the TV on. And a few hours later, I woke up, and guess what I saw? Gore has retracted his concession, and the election is going on, and he came out and he said, we're going to file some lawsuits, and we're going to see this thing. And the next morning I got up, and they said, it's going to take a couple of days for us to get this all sorted out, as it has to go through the court process. We know it didn't take a couple of days. It took 35 days as it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And finally, after all the year of election and 35 days after the election, they said, okay, there is an election. Bush has won. The very next day, I turned on the news, and guess what they were talking about? I wonder who's going to run next time around. 4 years from now, we haven't even had the inauguration, and you're already talking about the next election. All of the countdowns that we go through. New Year's Eve, people count down. They turn on the TV, they watch the ball in New York City, maybe they have a party, whatever, but they like to watch as we count down to midnight, and we say there's going to be a new year. When the girls were small, Kasha and I cheated, because at the time we had Netflix. We don't anymore, but we did then. And Netflix had an ingenious idea for parents. They made a little cartoon clips. There were several of them. They were maybe 30 seconds long. You got to pick which cartoon character you wanted to watch, and they did this little cartoon clip, and then the cartoon character did a 10-second countdown, and then they did cartoon fireworks, and they said Happy New Year, and you could play that whenever you wanted to. The girls had heard about this New Year's Eve, and they said, we want to count down. We want to count down to midnight. Cash and I wanted to go to bed. So we said, here's what we're going to do. 9 o'clock, we put the apple juice in the cups, and we got there around the TV, and we hit play, and we counted down to 0, and we said, Happy New Year, it's time for bed. It was 9 o'clock. Now, let me tell you something. We did not lie. We never said it was midnight. We just said it's time for the countdown, all right? So there are countdowns. This was the countdown. Palm Sunday, today is the countdown to Easter. Palm Sunday over 2,000 years ago was when Jesus rode into the gates of Jerusalem, and they were shouting, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, and they're waving the palm branches, fulfilling so many of the Old Testament prophecies. By the way, including the prophecy where Daniel, what we call it Daniel's 70 weeks, Daniel told us to the day when the Messiah would come into Jerusalem, and Jesus fulfilled it to the day on Palm Sunday. But that was the beginning of the countdown. Because you'll notice something as you read the Gospels, Jesus was always focused on this clock that he was on. It starts in John chapter 2 at the wedding of Cana when Jesus says to her son, you've got to do something. And Jesus says, woman, my hour has not yet come. Jesus said, listen, this isn't the time frame. This isn't the way I've got a clock that I'm paying attention to. But as you go through the Gospels, you notice him mentioning his hour time and time again. In the verses we're going to read this morning, it says, and Jesus, knowing his hour had come. Jesus knows that Palm Sunday is the clock. Jesus knows that Palm Sunday is when the sand starts falling through the hourglass. It's now a countdown to the cross. So Sunday morning he comes in, as they're crying, blessed is he who comes. Monday is a day of, he goes into the temple and he sees the money changers and he drives out the money changers and he says, my Father's house is to be called a house of prayer. Tuesday is a day of teaching. They ask him, what's the greatest commandment? Lord, out of all the commandments, what's the greatest? He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Second, love your neighbor as yourself. All the commandments hang on those two. But he also taught on Tuesday when they asked him about end-time events, and Pastor James just referred to it in Matthew 24 and 25 and Mark 13. He talks about when they said, what will be the end and the sign of your coming? And he tells them those things. Wednesday is a day of betrayal, as Judas slips away from the crowd, and he goes to the religious leaders and he said, how much will you give me? How much will you give me if I deliver him into your hands and betray him? Thursday, which is what we're going to talk about this morning, is the Last Supper. We're going to be there this morning. Friday, we're going to get together here on Friday night, and we're going to do what they did on Friday, which is focus on the cross. Friday was Good Friday. It was the day Jesus died on the cross. Saturday, the tomb was guarded and the disciples were scattered. But Sunday morning, up from the grave, he arose, and the angel said, he is not here. He is risen. But this morning we're going to look at Thursday, which is the Last Supper. Thursday is we're in our minds going to pack our bags this morning. We're going to go back to that night because the disciples didn't know this was going to be the Last Supper. I want you to understand that. We know that it is. We get to read it, but we read what happens after that. We know this is their last opportunity to sit at the table with Jesus. They didn't know that. They were gathering for what they thought was just a Passover meal. Now, for those of you not familiar with Passover, Passover in their culture was basically like Thanksgiving in ours. It all revolved around a meal where we're supposed to think about what we're thankful for. In their case, Passover was to be thankful for what happened that night in Egypt. Way back in the book of Exodus, when they are in slavery in Egypt and they are in bondage, and God says, I'm going to deliver you, but here's how I'm going to do it. Not with an army. Here's what I'm going to do. Each of you take a lamb and roast a lamb and take the blood of that lamb and put it on the doorpost of your home. And when the death angel comes to bring judgment, when I see the blood, help me this morning, I will pass over you. And God said, never forget what happened that night when they were delivered, when God brought them out of Egypt and he parted the Red Sea and they marched out into the wilderness. And so from that moment on, every year, just like Thanksgiving, they would go, but instead of getting a turkey, they would get a lamb, and they did what God told them. They got together with friends and family, and they roasted the lamb, and they sat around, and they had that meal, and they talked about that night in Egypt. And they talked about God's deliverance, and they talked about how God brought them out, and they talked about all those things. And so the disciples are looking forward to this, Passover. Jesus had told them 2 days before this event to go into the city. Peter and John go into Jerusalem. You're going to see a man carrying a jug of water, and when you do, go to him and tell him the master has need of the room. We're ready now for this room. And so he said, it's already set up. I've already talked to this guy, and when you go in and find him, he's going to take you to that room where we will celebrate Passover. And so they go and they find that man, and they go to him, and he takes them to that upper room, and he shows them the room. It's already set up. There's a table. There's plenty of chairs, and everything's ready to go for what will take place 2 days later on Thursday, which is the Last Supper. And so they gather on Thursday night. So imagine with me, if you will, as we go on this trip this morning, as they gather on Thursday night, as the sun is beginning to slip in the distance, and it's beginning to get dark, and the candles are flickering in the little room that they're in, and the lamps are flickering. They walk in, and there's the table spread before them. There's the roasted lamb. There's all this stuff sitting around. And they come to have this meal, and they have not been paying attention because Jesus has been telling them over and over again, I am about to be delivered up. I'm about to be betrayed. I'm about to be killed. He has told them as many times as he knows how and as many ways as he knows how, but they've not really been paying attention. And so that night in that room, can you imagine, of all the things they are doing, they're arguing about who is greatest among them. Here they are, the disciples, sitting around the table arguing about, you know what, out of the 12 of us, I'm a bigger deal than you are. I mean, I'm more important than you are. If we have to make a list here, you'd fall here and I'd fall here. That's what they're doing. They're arguing. Can you believe they did it quite a bit in the scripture? The Bible says many times Jesus had told them, the last shall be first and the first shall be last, and he that would be greatest should be servant of all. He told them, but they'd not been paying attention. So this night they're arguing. I can imagine how the argument went. You probably can too. Peter he probably went first because he often went first. He probably said, you know what, I'm kind of the leader among us. Every time there's something to be said, I'm the one that says it. When Jesus said, who do men say that I am? You guys said nothing. I'm the one that said you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. By the way, I'm the only one that ever walked on water with him. Maybe I didn't make it far, but I made it further than the rest of you guys. I am the most important in the room. Surely Andrew must have smiled and said, Peter, you wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for me. Andrew is Peter's brother. He's the way Peter found Jesus. He went and got Peter and said, we have found the Messiah. In fact, every time we find Andrew, he's bringing people to Jesus. He might have said, I'm the biggest heel in this room because I'm the one that brought you here. Nathaniel, he could have said so, because Nathaniel could have said, when I met Jesus, the first thing he ever said was, here is a disciple in who there is no deceit. How many of others did he ever say that about you? None of you, just me. Maybe it was Judas. I mean, that's hard to believe, but Judas was the treasurer. You know you trust somebody when you let them carry your money, right? And Judas could have said, I'm the one that carries the money bag. Jesus chose me for that job. I'm the most important in the room. James and John had a habit of arguing about being greatest. They had a habit of it several times throughout the scriptures. They talked about it. Lord, when we get to heaven, can one of us sit at your right hand? Can one of us sit at your left? They even went so far once as to bring their mom into it. They went to their mom and said, Mommy, would you tell Jesus we want to be the most important in heaven? And she comes, and the Bible says the other disciples were irritated. They got frustrated with this constant, we want to be first and all this. As all of this is going on in the room, I want you to see what Jesus says. So look in John chapter 13 and verse 1. And it says, now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come, that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And supper being ended, the devil having already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand, and that he had come from God and was going to God, rose from supper, and laid aside his garments, and took a towel and girded himself. And after that he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. And then jump down to verse 15, and it says, for I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. And so I want you to think about being in that room that night. Can we go there in our minds tonight? Can we sit around that table in the darkness with the lamps flickering and the candles flickering, and everybody's arguing about greatness, and they're sitting there eating the roasted lamb and having this dinner? And Jesus gets up and he goes over toward the door where there was a bowl and there was a pitcher of water and there was a towel. The reason for that was that in that culture, as you probably know, they didn't have cars, they didn't even have bicycles. In the city, they walked everywhere they went. And they didn't have nice shoes like we have. They had sandals. And they walked around on those dirt streets that were there in the city. And dirt when it's hot and dry, and mud when it's wet, right? So they're walking on these streets of dirt and mud. But that's not the only things that were walking on the streets of the people. No, there were also horses and donkeys and sheep and goats and all these other things. And how many know all of those animals that go on the streets, they leave some stuff behind, right? They leave little presents everywhere they go. They kind of leave a little trail everywhere they go. And this is what people are walking in. Up and down those dirt streets every day. Up and down, stepping and all that stuff that's there on the streets. It's nasty, it's disgusting. And so it was common that every home had by the door a pitcher of water and a bowl and a towel, so that a person, maybe they had cleaned that morning and taken a bath and everything else, but now they've been walking all day and it's just nasty. And so they come in, and the scripture says they would go to that bowl of water, and somebody would wash their feet as they came into the home. It was the lowest job because, as you can imagine, who wants this job? Nobody wants this job. And so if a household had multiple servants, this job was given to the lowest of the servants. If a household had no servants, this was given to the youngest in the household. This was given to the lowest of the rank. They got this nasty and dirty job. And if somebody got down to wash somebody else, it was their way of recognizing, I am the lowest, I am the least, because I'm washing everybody else. And so in that night, here they are in that upper room as they're arguing. Peter and James and John and Matthew and Nathaniel and Thomas, they're all bickering up there. Judas, they're all talking about, I'm greater than you, I'm more important than you, I'm this and I'm that. And Jesus gets up from the table and he walks over and he grabs a towel and he takes a towel like this and he goes over by the door where there's a bowl and he's got a pitcher of water. And I want you to imagine as Jesus comes that day and he gets on his knees and he fills that bowl with water. And he takes the disciples' feet and he begins to take those sandals off and he takes those dirty, nasty feet and he begins to wash them and he begins to dry them with the towel. And here he's done all this for them. He's doing this right in the middle of their arguing about who was greatest. Jesus gets down and he does that. And then he says, now as I have done, he says, you should do as I have done to you. I want you to notice he did not say do what I did, but he said do as I did. Why do I say that? Because there have been some churches throughout history that has said that what he did should be an ordinance of the church. In other words, we should do it just like we do communion and water baptism. Very regularly we should practice these things. We should practice foot washing. And so there are some churches that that's what they've done throughout the years. Just like we would do communion, they would have certain services set aside where they'd say, we're going to have a shorter song service, we're going to have a quick devotional, and then we're bringing in the bowls and bringing in the towels and we're bringing in the water, and we're going to take the rest of the service and we're going to take turns washing each other's feet. But that's not what Jesus said. Why? Because we don't live in that same culture. We don't live in that same world. You didn't, obviously, most of you did not walk here. And if you did, you didn't walk here in sandals on dirt roads. That's not the culture we live in. We don't need that to be done. And so what Jesus is saying is, I'm not saying to repeat this act over and over again. I'm saying take the heart of what I did, which is serving. Take the heart of the fact that I got down and I served all of these other people while they were arguing about who was the greatest among them. The Son of God got down on his knees and he served. And so this morning, I want to talk about grab a towel. It's time for us to look at Jesus' example and grab a towel and become servants of the Lord. And here's the first thing we see this morning. If we're going to be real servants of God, we must be watching. I want you to notice this morning that Jesus got up because he noticed this is something that needs to be done, and nobody has done it, and nobody's going to do it. Jesus looked around that room, and he could smell all of that nasty stuff that had been carried in from the streets in that room, and here is something that needs to be done, should have been done. But nobody had done it, and nobody was going to do it, and so Jesus got up himself, and he began to do it. You know, spiritual gifts are a wonderful thing. The Bible talks about them very specifically. It tells us that when we're saved, every single believer, you and you and you and me, every single believer has spiritual gifts, right? And that means that God gives us abilities. He gives us supernatural abilities to do things and do things better so we can serve the kingdom and be a blessing to others. But here's the sad thing about that, is that too many times throughout history, Christians have used an excuse of spiritual gifts to limit what they're willing to do. Have you ever noticed that before? I've noticed that it sounds something like this. You know, there's a need in a church, and there's something that really needs to get done. And somebody asks somebody, would you be willing to? And you know what they say? Well, you know, I would, but that's just not my spiritual gift. Listen to something this morning. Spiritual gifts are wonderful. It's wonderful to have them. It's wonderful to know what they are. I heard one person say, my gift is singing, and somebody else said, well, then you belong in the prison choir. They said, what do you mean by that? They said, because you're always behind bars and you never can find the right key. If you're going to sing, get in the prison choir, right? And so we need to know our spiritual gifts, but gifts are meant to help us be better at the things we do. It's not meant to eliminate other things. It's not meant to say, well, I don't need to do that because that's not my spiritual gift. Even worse is when people say this, well, I'm not going to do that because I'm not called to that. Have you heard that before? I'm just not called to that. Listen, in this story, did you notice that Jesus did not receive a call to foot washing? Did you notice that there was no voice from heaven that said, this is my son? Now, Jesus, go get the bowl and get the water. He didn't have an audible call from his Father. An angel didn't show up and tell him to do it. He didn't have any particular spiritual gift. He just looked around and saw this needs to be done, and I can do it. Let me tell you this morning, and if you're taking notes, write this down. Sometimes the need is the call. Sometimes just the fact that there's a need is God's way of saying there's a need, you see it, now do something about it. Sometimes the need is the call. We must be watching. Jesus got up that night and did what nobody else was willing to do simply because he saw a need and said this needs to be done. People of the towel, people that grab a towel and serve say, I don't have to be called by God to do it, just to know there's a need and I'm going to serve. Here's the second thing this morning is that we must be willing to do it. Jesus got up as they were arguing about who was greatest, and he literally made himself the least. Now listen, the Son of God literally made himself the rank of the lowest servant in any household when he got up and he did that. I remember when I was in Bible college, I had a preaching professor, and he only taught the one class because he pastored one of our great churches in Oklahoma City, and he was a pastor, and he taught this preaching class. And one day he and I were talking, and he was talking about when he first started out preaching, and he said, I was about 19, and he said occasionally, little churches that needed help, they would call the Bible college and say, could you send one of the students? And he said, and so I would get these invitations to go to these churches. And he also played the trumpet. So when he would go somewhere, he said he would play the trumpet before he would preach. And he said he went to a little church outside Tulsa, Oklahoma on a Sunday night. And he said, I knew it was a tiny little town. It was a tiny little church. He said they might have had 25 people there on Sunday night. He said, but when I showed up, he said, I thought I was Billy Graham. He said, they had invited me. He said, I walked in that place all puffed up. He said, I told the pastor, can I go check out the stage and the pulpit, get a feel for where I'm going to be? Can I kind of get set up? I want to get ready. He said, and then on top of that, he said, I told the pastor, if it's okay with you, I really believe it would bless your people if I played my trumpet before I preach. Is that okay with you? He said, I thought I was the biggest deal in the world. He said, the pastor said, that's fine. We don't have a band. We just have one piano player on an old little upright acoustic piano. It was an old man. And he said, he looked and he said, that old man was sitting over there kind of hunched over, had on suspenders, a little tiny bow tie. And he said, he walked over to that old man and he said, listen, he said, I'm going to play my trumpet before I preach. He said, and I'm going to play the song, Looking for a City Where We'll Never Die. He said, and if you want to play with me, you're welcome to play along if you think you can keep up. And he said, that old man smiled and he said, I'll do my best. And he stuck out his hand. He said, my name's Marvin P. Dalton. I wrote that song. And he said he went to the pastor and he thought he was kidding. He said, wait a minute. He said, is this guy for real? And the guy said, yes. He retired outside of Tulsa. He said, you go pick up your hymnal, flip through it. His name's all throughout that hymnal. He's wrote a lot of the great hymns of the church. And then my pastor went back to him and he said to Marvin P. Dalton, he said, there's a new plan. He said, I'm no longer playing tonight. You're playing a piano solo. I'm going to sit over here and watch, right? Because he said, I walked in thinking I was the biggest deal in the world. He said, I realized I was about this big in his presence. And that's how it was that night. As they're arguing about who is greatest, and all of a sudden, here is Jesus that gets up from the table. Jesus, the Bible said, all things were created by him. So Jesus, who threw the stars into space, and Jesus that created the angels and created you and me, gets up that night from the table. Jesus, who walked with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and stood before Jericho with his sword drawn, Jesus gets up that night. Jesus, who when he became flesh, the angels sang, and God put a star in the sky, and kings came before him and dropped their gold and frankincense and myrrh, got up from the table. Jesus, who walks on water and who speaks to the storms and they die down, and he speaks to the demons and they flee. Jesus, who rose from the grave, this is the Son of God, gets up as they're arguing about who is the greatest. He gets up and says, you know what? I am willing to do it. We must be willing. We must be willing enough to say, I'm willing to do it. There is nothing beneath me. All right, I'm not too big to do anything. Here's the next thing about being willing. He served people who didn't deserve it. Now, we look around that table that night, and there are some guys that, as far as I know, they were pretty good guys. I mean, Nathaniel, Jesus did say there's no deceit in him. Andrew, every time we see him, he's bringing people to Jesus. These were good guys. I can see maybe that. But then there's other people that night that Jesus watched. How about this? He watched Peter, who in just a number of hours is going to deny him not once, but 3 times. In fact, one time he's even going to begin to curse and say, I never even knew that man. And Jesus got down on his knees and he watched Peter. Judas, who's already betrayed him, and in just a couple of hours is going to go and get them and bring them to the garden and betray him even with a kiss of all things. But he gets down on his knees and he watches Judas. And even the other guys who were all, as far as I know, good guys, later that night, they're all going to flee and they're all going to forsake him, every single one of them. And yet he got on his knees to people who didn't deserve it, and he served. You see, that's where we're called to serve. We're called to serve even people we don't think they deserve it. God said that's not for you to decide. You just simply serve where there is a need. He also served without being asked. Nobody said, Jesus, would you mind doing this? And there wasn't a sign-up sheet. Nobody had to say, Jesus, we need this to be done. He just served without being asked. I was thinking about it the other day. In our 18 years here, there have only been 2 times I can remember this has happened, but 2 different times, and it's been a long time ago when it did happen, but 2 different times, I've had people come and they'd say, Pastor, we just wanted you to know we're not going to attend church here anymore, and we wanted to tell you why. We wanted you to know what we didn't like, right? We want to make sure you know what we didn't like. And they would begin to tell me that. And in both cases, without fail, in both cases, I thought about it long and hard. In both cases, they not one time ever served anywhere. I tried to think about it. They didn't help anywhere. They didn't serve anywhere. They just wanted to tell me what they didn't like about what the rest of us weren't doing, but they weren't doing anything on their own. One of the times was the time that was most unbelievable. They came and they were very specific. Well, we think a church should do this, and this is how the church should have treated us, and we think this is a ministry the church should have had, and I agreed with them. And I said, you know what? You brought it to my attention. I said, and I think you're right, and I think we need to start a ministry that focuses on just that. And I said, so how about this? Instead of leaving, why don't you stay, and you don't even have to head it up, but just be a part of it. You would have thought I had spit in their face. They were so insulted that I would even mention them doing something. They said, no, I don't want to do that. I'm just saying somebody should have been doing this, but I don't want to do it. And I just thought, I don't understand. You're complaining about what other people aren't doing, but you're not willing to do anything yourself. Listen, this morning, we need to serve, and we shouldn't have to be asked to do it. We should need to be say, we are people of the towel who just simply say, there is a need, and we will serve. He served without expectation of payment or reward. Jesus didn't say, guys, I'm going to go get the bowl, and I'm going to go get the towel, and I'm going to wash your feet, but it's going to cost you. Don't think I'm doing this for free. I'm going to call in a favor one day. I want some payback. Jesus didn't do that. He said, if I never get a thank you, if I never even get recognition for it, I'm willing to do it just because I'm wanting to serve the Lord. He also served in a time of great difficulty. Do you understand that the Bible says he knew his hour had come? Jesus knew, according to the Old Testament, he knew what was going to happen because the Old Testament told us what was going to happen. It said his beard would be ripped from him. It said he would be beaten so badly he would be unrecognizable. It said they would shove a crown of thorns into his head. It said that he was going to be nailed to a cross. Jesus knows that all of that is now hours, not days or weeks or months, but hours away. And in the middle of all that, knowing he's about to face that, this is what he's doing. Can you imagine that? I mean, here he's about to face this physical and spiritual trial that he's going to go through. And in the middle of all of that, this is what he's doing, serving in a time of great difficulty. One time when this was brought to my attention, I was a young kid when this happened, but it has stuck in my mind ever since. I was maybe 7 years old, and my great-grandmother was passing away, and she was at the hospital, and she was in the cardiac care unit for a couple of weeks, and she had 9 kids. So my grandmother was one of 8. There were 9 of them, and those 9 begat a lot of grandkids who begat a lot of great-grandkids. There were a lot of us, and the family was a close family. And what that meant was that for the 2 or 2.5 weeks that she was there in the cardiac care unit, there were a big portion of our family never, ever left the waiting room. We just took turns. We just cycled in and out. There were a lot of them there all the time in that waiting room. And there were other families there too, but there was at least probably 20, 30 or more of our family that was there round the clock taking turns doing this. But I remember when she passed away, and you know how that goes. She passed away, and maybe 2 days later we had the funeral. And the very next day after the funeral, I walked in my grandmother's kitchen, and I smelled she'd been cooking, and she's got something in a crock pot over here, and she's got a casserole dish over here. And I said, oh, that sounds good. I said, what time are we eating? And she said, oh, this isn't for us. And you know how that feels, right? I mean, your heart just sinks. You're like, what do you mean? I have to smell this, and I can't even eat. I said, what do you mean this isn't for us? And she said, no. She said, I'm taking this to the hospital. And I just was puzzled. I looked at her for a second. I said, what are you talking about, to the hospital? I said, we're done with that. We had the funeral yesterday. She said, yeah, we're done with that. But she said, those other families that we were there with in the waiting room, that she said, I got to know most of them pretty well. And I know they've still got loved ones that are there. And she said, they're going to be up there for a while. And she said, so I'm taking this to them. And so we're going to take it to the hospital and drop it off. And we've got some paper plates and some paper cups and paper bowls and all that stuff. But she said, we've got to make a stop on the way. I'll never forget this. She ran by the bank and ran through the drive-thru because she wanted to get rolls of quarters. And I said, what in the world do we need rolls of quarters for? And she said, well, because then nobody had a cell phone. There was one phone in the hall, but there was a pay phone. And she said, they're going to need to use that pay phone to get in hold of other family members. And she said, so I'm going to drop off some quarters. And for about 2 weeks after that funeral, she went back to the hospital every day to either drop something off or pick something up, to clean it up, whatever she had to do. And I remember thinking to myself, she has just spent 2 weeks on her own, sleepless nights in there with her mom, round the clock in the waiting room, dealing with all that, and then buries her own mother. And the very next day is in there cooking food to take people to the hospital because they were still going through something. And that was burned in my mind. And I thought, that's what servanthood is all about. Even if I might be going through something, I still want to serve other people. And Jesus, facing what he faced, still got up that night because, one, he was watching. He said, there's a need and I'm going to do it. Number 2, because he was willing, he said, I'm going to get down and do it no matter how hard, no matter how difficult. And here's the last thing this morning. We must be working. It says no job was beneath him. Here was a job that was both disgusting and demeaning because it meant you were announcing that you considered yourself the lowest person in the room. Here is a son of God who gets up in front of all that room of people arguing about who's greatest. And Jesus said, you know what? Somebody's got to be working, and I'm willing to do it. He did it, and he did it until it was done. The Bible says he did it for each and every one of them. Jesus didn't start the job and then say, you know what? I've done 3 disciples. Now somebody else take the towel. Now somebody else rotate me out. Somebody else take over. I've done my part. Jesus didn't do that. He said, I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do it until every single one has been washed. Let me close this morning with this verse, Galatians chapter 5, verse 13. Paul wrote to this church, and he said to them, for you, brethren, have been called to liberty. He said, only do not use liberty as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. That's what he said. Through love serve one another. I told you it was 2 days before this Last Supper. And Pastor James mentioned it was 2 days before when the disciples came to Jesus and they said, Lord, they said, tell us about when are these things going to happen and what will be the sign of your coming? And that's when Jesus said what Pastor James mentioned. He said, see this temple, not one stone is going to be left upon it. It's all going to come crashing down. And then he began to walk through the signs of his coming and all that. But when he gets to the end of that, in Matthew chapter 25, now he's no longer talking about the fact that he is coming, and he's no longer talking about the signs of his coming. Now he's saying, and this is going to happen after I have come. And here's what he says. He says, and every single person is going to stand before me in that day. Every single one of us. He said, and there are going to be some people in that day when they stand before Jesus. Here's what he's going to say. I was hungry, and you fed me. And I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. And I was sick, and you came and visited me. And I was in prison, and you came to me. And I was naked, and you brought me clothes. And I was a stranger, and you took me in. And you remember what he said was going to happen is some people, when he says that, are going to look into the face of the Son of God. They're going to look into the face of Jesus, and they're going to say, Lord, when did we do that? We don't remember that. I mean, for those of us that live in this age when he's not physically walking among us, we never had that opportunity. We're going to stand before him and say, Lord, give me one example when I ever did that for you. And you remember what Jesus said he's going to say in that day? When you did it unto the least of these, you did it unto me. You see, this morning Jesus said, I am coming, and I'm coming soon. And when I come, I'm going to face each and every one of you, and I'm going to ask, what did you do for me? And in that moment, we're going to have to fess up and say, Lord, this is what I did. And unfortunately, there are going to be a lot of people who are going to say, nothing. He also told the parable of the talents. Those that took their talents and went and did something else, and the one who took his talent and buried it and did nothing with it. Because he said he was afraid. He said he was afraid of doing something. So he just left it there in the ground. He did nothing. When Jesus comes again. Can I tell you something this morning? The clock is ticking. The clock is ticking right now. Not just to Good Friday, not just to Easter Sunday, but to the second coming of Jesus. He's coming again. And when he comes, each and every one of us are going to face him. And he's going to look at us and he's going to say, when did you use this? When did you do something for me? When did you choose to use your abilities and your gifts to be a blessing to the church and a blessing to other people? When did you do something for me? And the answer this morning is when we do it unto the least of these, we do it unto him. There might be people this morning, you're saying, you know, I can't do anything but change diapers. When you do it unto the least of these, you do it unto him. I can't do anything but drive a bus to pick up bus kids on Wednesday. When you do it unto the least of these, I can't do anything but go over to the nursing home and be a minister to somebody else that's over there. When you do it to the least of these, Jesus said, I'm coming again, and you have an opportunity right now. You have an opportunity now, Jesus is saying, to serve him. Stand this morning if you would. And Paul said, through love serve one another. With your heads bowed and eyes closed this morning, you have incredible gifts. You're a child of God. If you're a believer this morning, you have incredible spiritual gifts. God has enabled you to do so many wonderful things for his kingdom and for others. And he's called us to do certain things. But that does not limit us in what we can do. That doesn't limit us. That's just to say that God's made us better at doing some things. It's not saying that he's saying there's others we can't do. Instead, he's saying tonight, look around. This morning, look around. Be watching. Look around and see where there's a need this morning and say, you know what? I don't have to be asked to do it. There's a need. It needs to get done, and I'm willing. Be watching this morning and be willing to say, you know what? Nothing's beneath me. I don't feel too good to do anything. I'm willing to get on my knees and serve. And maybe I've done it before. Maybe I feel like I've done my turn. That's okay. Jesus did his turn for sure, but he kept going. And we don't have to stop serving. We don't have to ever give up. We just say, I'm going to keep going until the Lord comes. And lastly this morning, to be working, because one day Jesus is coming. It could be tonight for all I know. The trumpet could sound tonight, and by tomorrow morning, you and I could be standing face to face with the Lord. By tonight, we could be standing face to face with the Lord. And he could ask us that question and say, when did you serve me? Can you put your finger on? Can you find a moment? Can you find a time? Can you find a place where you said you were willing to serve? And he's telling us right now the way to do it is to serve the least among us, to find a need and to fill it. Not just in our church, but in the world around us. He's saying, be people who learn to grab a towel. Would you come and find a place this morning and get on your knees and begin to thank the Lord for his example to you, but at the same time ask him to give us a servant's heart. Could you do that this morning? God, help us. Help us, Lord, to know that we're not too important. We're not too busy. We're not too anything to be servants for you. Help us, Lord, to see the need and to fill it.